knew that his plan to marry Mrs. Simpson could bring down the government. As the king said, his hope was to marry on the throne without precipitating a political struggle. When Edward VIII became king after the death of his father, George V, he was already in love with the divorced and remarried Wallis Simpson. In the following October, Mrs. Simpson filed for divorce and panic broke loose in the government. Edward was determined that she would be queen or nothing, an empress of India, the whole bag of tricks. Horrors. In November, the king told Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin that he wished to marry Wallis. Baldwin told him it was impossible. The king raised the possibility he might abdicate, and shocked, Baldwin stalled. The Chancellor, Neville Chamberlain, feared that the king would force the resignation of government if it did not grant him his wish, and so he felt the king had to be pushed out first. Chamberlain wanted, he said later, a sort of coup d'etat with no public discussion of the pros and cons. Baldwin was largely keeping his cabinet in the dark, let alone the public. But those who knew the full story were split between wanting the king forced out quickly and, like Baldwin, desiring him to make the decision to leave himself. Then Winston Churchill threw a spanner in the works. He was pro the king and the marriage, and he was suggesting taking the matter to Parliament and to the people, an idea that Baldwin found completely terrifying. There was talk that Churchill would form a King's Party with supporters of the king, all working against Baldwin to force his resignation. Baldwin had to consult the cabinet in a meeting of complete secrecy to discuss the marriage and the possibility that Churchill would form an alternative government. There were no minutes of this meeting and no record given to the king. Baldwin and his cabinet hoped to force the king into a corner and head off Churchill. The Prime Minister consulted the Prime Ministers of the 5 Dominions, and they were all opposed. Baldwin told the king that he must abdicate if he wanted to marry. Edward asked to broadcast to the Empire to explain his side of the story, to attempt to win the people to his cause, but the Prime Minister refused. The king had no choice but to abdicate. Baldwin announced the abdications to the Commons in an electrifying speech. There was no provision in law for a sovereign to abdicate, and His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act was passed on the 11th of December 1936. The king had signed his own declaration of abdication on the previous day, but remained king until he gave his royal assent to the act, to which individual dominions gave assent. Edward was forced into exile, and George VI, his brother, became king. Now is the time to go, Baldwin had said after his speech announcing the abdication. He had rather brilliantly averted the political crisis of the abdication, remembered as not a political story, but a personal story about the king's individual choice. And yet, I'd argue, it had been a distraction. All eyes then had been on Wallis, while Germany had been strengthening and rearming, ready for war.